Good morning, Bulgarians, Sofians. It's good to have our time together this morning, and I have Michaela with me, per usual from the
Hi,
last time.
everyone.
So let's jump into this. We're going to get into John chapter 9. I appreciate Dima and the brothers for allowing me to share some things, and Michaela to share some things regarding this chapter. One of my favorites, looking at the response, some of the narratives that have come out of this chapter have been the response of the blind man and how his courage increases as he's being pressed by the religious leaders of that time. And obviously the famous, the blind will see, and those who are seeing will become blind. There are some very interesting comments and narratives that come out of this story. So it's a very famous story. And so we're going to go ahead and start reading in a second, but I want to just give a little bit of context. Jesus is in Jerusalem, and if you go back to chapter 7, he was at a feast. Do you remember the feast he was at? I'm putting you on the spot here.
No.
Feast of Tabernacles, because I looked at it. And that's where he kind of went incognito, in secret, and on the last and greatest day expressed living water and all that stuff. And so the conversations and the debates around him were, is he the Messiah? So we kind of join that debate and that conversation as he hits chapter 9, and we run across this blind man. So we're going to start reading, and I'm going to have Michaela, if you could, read through verse 12. And today, guys, just so you know, we're not going to read the entire chapter for time's sake. We're going to kind of allude to some different points of the different passages here, but we are going to read this first section through verse 12.
All right, chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they demanded. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said.
Just the beginning of the dialogue with this man who had his eyes opened, and it gets very interesting as the discussion goes further. But there's some things that definitely jump out, and especially in light of what we're experiencing around the world, but especially here in America with seeing. And we had talked previously about this interaction with this blind man, and just want to.
I think what I was really struck with, that I don't think I had noticed before, but the very first sentence when Jesus was going along, it says he saw a blind man. And I think the thing that really struck me was just that Jesus saw, that he was looking. And a couple things that, it's interesting, this is the third time in about 2 weeks that this particular phrase has really come out to me. So a couple of weeks ago, someone brought up a message that a brother was teaching on, and he was using a Zulu word called sawu bona, which means "I see you." And that was in the context of really looking at the pain and suffering of people around us and being able to look at them and notice them. Because I think we can get involved in our busy lives and not even pay attention to the pain and suffering that are happening. And then the next week, my son found out I'd never seen the movie Avatar. And so he made me watch it. It took 3 times of sitting down to watch it, but I finally saw it. And one of the things they do in that movie, the way that they connect with one another is to say, I see you. So this was sort of something that has been in my mind a lot lately. And then when I read this where Jesus sees this blind man, I know there were probably a lot of people along the wayside that were ill or sick in some way, or there were crowds, but he noticed. And it really challenges me in having the heart of God of, do I see people? And especially with the racial tensions that we have going on locally for us in the US, and it's spread even worldwide, the plight of those who are Black. And do I see certainly not the skin color, but beyond that, to the pain, to the suffering. And Jesus absolutely saw. And so it challenges me to look and see.
Yeah, I think seeing though too is also, we have been investigating understanding. And so I think to see, you have to understand.
Right.
In this, Jesus understood that this man was born blind. Somehow he had gotten information. The man probably was in their area a number of times, and he had understood that, which is much different than becoming blind. So that plight is much different. So being born blind, being healed of that was very significant. We were talking earlier about just the messianic inferences with this healing, which is very interesting too, because Jesus goes ahead and he sees him, and then he heals him. He acts on it. But it's interesting. The prior discussions have been on, is he the Messiah or not? And there are a number of verses that talk in the Old Testament. We were just looking at
Isaiah 35 verse 5, which promises that when the Messiah comes, he's going to heal the blind. So this was like a neon sign to them, or it should have been, that here was the Messiah in their midst doing something promised in the Old Testament. And I think what you mentioned, John, which is really important, it's not just good enough for us to see and notice, but that Jesus went beyond that and walked towards it, and he healed, he touched, he made mud.
Yeah. What did you see? So the disciples also saw. But what was their response as far as this moment in time?
Sort of why is he, who was, obviously there was sin involved. So who sinned? Was it this guy or his parents?
Without getting into that was actually a very common debate back then with the rabbis, is who sinned. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but that was a big debate. And in the rabbinic circles, they would typically do this. They would have an object lesson, and then they would have a discussion revolving around the different ideas that were kind of tossed about by these rabbis. And so this was very much in line with how they would do these discussions. However, Jesus dismisses it. He goes, guys, we're not debating this. This is not about the debate. We have an individual here who needs help. We need to go ahead and deal with this. And, very, very interesting. He dismisses the debate. It's a way of doing that. So the spit in the mud, sometimes I can look over that and on the eyes. Tell me, if you were the blind person.
I wouldn't know what was happening.
Well, you wouldn't know it, but you'd hear the loogie. You'd hear the...
Ew. Maybe, but I'm blind, so I'm probably going to feel it as a salve on my eye.
Yeah, they actually used it back in that day. I was looking at some things. The saliva was used as a healing type of topical ointment that people would put on. So he probably was receptive to it. I know in my day, if I heard somebody do a big, clearing of their throat and making this mud, I would have hesitancy in letting them put that on me.
Well, you also have cleanliness things.
I have those issues. So anyways, but what's interesting too is that they make the saliva and the mud and he puts it on. He's done this before too. He's done it. If you look in a couple other places, he's done this spit and mud thing over in Mark, but he makes him walk to the pool of Siloam. And I was looking, I'm a geographer, so I went online to find out what the distance from the temple was to the pool of Siloam. It's about a mile.
Wow.
And he had to go through the dung gate. So obviously he had to have people lead him. He's probably dripping with his saliva and mud coming down his eyes, and kind of a unique moment. He gets to the pool of Siloam. But what does that, we talk about these things as far as references to Old Testament stories, and we call them remezes. And there's sort of, I was looking at this, sort of a little bit of a remez here of a story that should come to mind. I'm putting you on the spot because we haven't even talked about this. So.
Well, I was thinking about Naaman.
That's it.
Oh, good. I got it.
You win.
So Naaman the leper, who resisted in the beginning to go and wash. But this blind man just got up and went. Yeah, and so what it shows is that Jesus could have healed. He's done this before. He's healed right on the spot. But actually the healing also coincided with actions by that individual. And we see many times that that faith is like two sides of a coin. It has the belief side, but it also has our response side, our participation. And it's a connection of both of those. And we have to understand that. So his healing didn't happen until those both connected. So I thought that was interesting too. Okay, so now let's look at the response, the initial response. This guy gets healed, and you get this response of the neighbors and his family, which I'm including in this neighbor family discussion here. What do you notice about this little dialogue at the end? And also, what do you notice about what might be missing? I already kind of shared this with you, so you'll have the answer. Well, I think the point you were talking about is they were talking about him while in his presence. So they were not even really talking directly to him. He almost had to stand up for himself and say, I'm the guy you're talking about. I was blind and now I'm seeing.
Right.
So.
Yeah, you'll see that throughout. This jumped out at me. Like even in the beginning when the disciples were saying, who sinned, this man or his parents or somebody else? They're not even addressing that man. He's there in earshot. But have you ever been in a situation where people are talking about you and they're, hey, I'm here, I'm in the room? There's so many of these moments in here. In the same way, they do the same thing, and he's like, excuse me, I'm here. And the neighbors don't, they're not even connected to him. They call him this man. What's unique about that?
What's his name?
What's his name? There's no name for this guy. So there's no even, you can see the community around him lacking empathy, lacking a connection. He didn't even have that from his neighbors.
Right.
And we see later, we're not going to read about it a ton, but the parents also are a little adrift and aloof from this guy.
They're missing the miracle.
They're missing the miracle. So what should their response have been?
Amazement.
Yeah.
Amazement.
So I'm going to share something. So this gentleman, it gets surprised by a group of friends who are going to have purchased a very expensive pair of glasses that allow him to see colors for the first time. And I want you to kind of watch his reaction as we look at this thing.
Nothing pieced together in my head because my birthday wasn't for another couple weeks. And I was like, what? Like, is this for me?
What? Come here! Come here!
Let's go!
Come here!
What's up? Turn around. Turn around. What's up?
There's no guarantee that these will work, but our soft team thought that you deserved a chance to try it.
Put them on, bro. As soon as I saw them, I was like, no freaking way.
He knew what it was, and he immediately broke down. And I was in tears. I could see everyone behind him was in tears. I was like, okay.
Like, what a gesture for them to coordinate, and there's more than 30 of them, like, and everybody's got busy lives, and it just, not only did they give me the glasses, which is a nice gift, but they all like banded together to do that for me, which was just pretty overwhelming.
We wanted to do it while the trees were still changing colors.
Fran's a really awesome person, and everyone on the team loves him and knew how much it would mean to him.
Look at us. Look at this.
to give him that opportunity to see something that all of us see every day and take for granted almost was really special.
Blow the balloons.
Oh my gosh. Leave them on, leave them on. You have to let your eyes adjust.
I remember there was this one yellow leaf on a tree, like straight ahead of me, and as soon as I put them on, like it just popped out, like striking. Like it wasn't like a light brownish gray color, like it was yellow.
I was about to say. Oh my god.
You're so bad.
But what an amazing story, just looking at the response of that
Yeah,
guy.
it brought tears to my eyes, that's for sure.
Yeah, so that's the response I would expect for this individual, to have people around him going, this is a game changer, let's stop.
I mean, he was only going from not seeing color to seeing color, and this guy in John chapter 9 was going from not seeing to finally being able to see. That's even huger.
No, it's crazy. So just amazing. And you know, it's really, really incredible. When you read through verses 13 and on, we get this back and forth with the Pharisees. And what was the bent regarding the Pharisees in general, in response to Jesus in this story also?
It almost felt like, because they didn't want to see Jesus for who Jesus was, they were just trying to find people to agree with them and discounting everyone. So discounting the man, discounting the fact that they never even really spent much time saying, this guy can see, this is so amazing. Just discounting everyone.
Yeah, I saw there was just such a quick rush to judgment. You know, if you look at, you know, verse 16 there, some Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath.
Mm.
And so there's a quick rush to judgment. When you see something like that, what do you think prompts that rush to judgment? What's in the backdrop that is pigeonholing Jesus as somebody that's not from God here? What is working in their life?
I don't think I know what you mean.
There's a bias there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's a slant. There's a bent. There's a theological way in which they viewed things. So I think sometimes our views can skew seeing God.
Well, I even thought about just personally when the man was sharing, when people were, he was saying, this is what happened to me. The man they called Jesus came and he put mud in my eyes and I washed and now I see. Like, I think about our own story about us connecting with Jesus. We need to be able to communicate our connection with Jesus. And yet they weren't looking at that at all. They weren't really like they were trying to poke holes in whatever his experience was. Well, it couldn't have been. You couldn't have, because it happened on the Sabbath, and God cannot work in the Sabbath in that way. I mean, it was almost like their preconceived ideas prohibited them, made them unable to see a miracle. And it just made me think about just in how I share my interaction with Jesus. Can I be that straightforward and be able to communicate the miracle that it is?
Yeah, they were trying to communicate what they were stuck on was their theology,
Mm-hmm.
and not the change in an individual, in a person, which is really very interesting. They got very hung up. They had quick rushes to judgment, and it's interesting too. The Sabbath issue was, you guys know this. The Sabbath issue was always a big deal, and we see so many times when it's almost as if Jesus is,
He did it on
I'm
purpose.
gonna do this because you're not getting the gist that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And this is another one. And initially I was looking at this and saying, well, yeah, he heals on the Sabbath. We've seen those things, but there's some other transgressions that would have really irked these guys. Just the ability to, when Jesus said, get up, take your, when he said, take your mat and walk, for that one individual, or to this guy, go to the pool of Siloam, they weren't allowed to travel during that time period. So he was technically violating their code that they put forward. There's a lot of code things that they had in their religious world that if it got violated, they just couldn't see beyond that.
Right. This is what it means to obey the Sabbath or keep the Sabbath holy. And then you have all these rules to prevent you from not making the Sabbath holy, and they were all man-made.
Right.
Yeah.
So it gets me to think too, and for us as a group, are there things within our culture, our upbringing, our religious culture that may parallel the things that are happening with the Pharisees, in the sense of, what's happening to blind them? Can we be blinded by religious thought? And I think at times we can. I think Jesus is definitely pointing this out. So it takes an investment to look at the true heart of things and what's happening here. So anything else jump out that you were interested in the section, that this dialogue? How about with the parents? So the parents come into play. What did you see there? You want to read that? Why don't we read that?
All right. It says, the Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see? We know he's our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind, but how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. And then it says that they said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. That is why his parents said, he is of age, ask him.
So you got a few thoughts on this, on the parents' interaction. How do you think first of all, how do you think that son felt when his parents responded like this?
I just think that was like almost a kick in the gut. I mean, I was trying to imagine as a mother giving birth to a child and then finding this day that he's seeing. But I'm so afraid of the religious culture around me. I'm so afraid of taking the wrong step that I can't celebrate what God has done in my child's life. I mean, that's just,
yeah,
I can't imagine it.
It had to have been disappointing if I was in his shoes. And then it gets to the last section, because we want to tie this up as we kind of finish off. I'm going to read this, verse 35 and on. It says, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And before we get there, they had thrown him out because he had really gotten in their grill, so to speak, because they were asking him and they kept asking the same questions. And finally he says, why aren't you listening? Do you want to become his disciples too? And they get all up in arms and they throw him out. They said, you're whatever they said about him, you're steeped in sin at birth. So that whole debate comes back there in verse 34. You're steeped in sin at birth. That's why you were born blind. How dare you lecture us? So there's this lack of, this whole religious stuff can also create within people a lack of teachability. It's very, very important to stay humble and to stay teachable. But then verse 35, I'm going to read this. Jesus heard they had thrown him out, and when they found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Jesus said, for judgment I've come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what? Are we blind too? Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. So kind of to pull this all together, the point is sometimes we read these stories and we look at how the guy responded and all these different things. But in reality, the Gospel of John was written to reveal, if you remember in chapter 1,
To reveal God.
to reveal the Father. And so Jesus was all, so I like to focus in on how Jesus responded. And what do you see here that's particular of note that we see in the Father?
Well, just like in the opening sentence where it said Jesus saw the man, in this verse 35, Jesus heard about him being thrown out, which I know must have been devastating. And it said he went and found him. And I think about God's heart, that he's finding us. He comes after us. He is the one who leaves the 99 behind in order to find us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the total heart of seeking it out. He could have just let it go at that and had the guy, but I think he had heard what had happened to him, it said. So I think in some ways I'm thinking
Moved with compassion.
Moved with compassion. He wants to be there for him when he gets out. And one of the things that I would expect from Jesus, if he knew the dialogue that was going out and going on between the Pharisees and how this guy had stood the test and had been courageous, would be to pat him on the back and say, "Great job," but you don't see that. How does he respond?
Do you believe in the Son of Man?
Yeah, so he's talking about faith. It's all about, so the Father, yes, we're encouraged by this. I'm sure he was encouraged by the blind man.
I think he probably went like this.
Probably did. But he also, but the bottom line issue is to say, you need to connect with who I am. And so he was really, really prepared to follow through and to make sure that he had that down straight. And, it's interesting looking at what really happened and why, God, Jesus has said in the beginning that this man's blindness and being healed was there for a set purpose, to reveal God's glory. And, so when we look at one of the things that kind of the take homes for us is also, we have sufferings that go on in our lives. We may have something that's been dogging us, a character thing that just we continually have to kind of deal with. Or we may have some physical attribute that, an illness, long-term pain or something that's happening, or it may be financial, or it may be relational. All these different things are like, God, why am I in this moment? Well, maybe it's to see how God is glorified through the moment and how you respond. And so I think we can respond one or two ways. We can get negative about it, or we can say, how is God's presence really going to be magnified by how I respond in this moment? So it's pretty cool. And I think there's a lot of storylines in this chapter. And please reread this. For time's sake, we didn't do it, but I want to finish about the progression, and I'm just want to talk just briefly about it. You see the progression of two groups of people. You see the progression of the man who's healed, where initially he sort of has a knowledge. He knows that it's Jesus. He knows his name in verse 11. Then you see him confess him in front of others. He says, hey, he's a prophet. So he's beginning to build on this framework of faith and courage and all these different things. And then in verse 33, he understands that he comes from God. And in the end, he lies prostrate. He worships before God and says, you see this progression of faith.
I believe.
And that's the direction. And there's this whole line of coming to it. But you also see in parallel, in contrast, the progression of negativity. It starts off away from Jesus. There's a progression of debate and division amongst these Pharisees. And you see the parents kind of not being engaged. You see quick judgment being applied because of their bias. And then you see the expulsion. So it doesn't get into a point of just, hey, I want to have a dialogue to find out who this guy is and what this miracle is about. They eventually just are, you see them kind of shutting their hearts down. And God will allow us to do that. He'll allow us to go in either direction. He'll help us in the direction towards him. But if we decide to go that other direction, that's kind of the trademark thing. It just kind of spins down that road.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as we're looking at our own faith, I think it's important to look at the two different types of movement that are happening in this thing. And I think there's a lot of cool stories that come out of this. But amen. Love you guys, and we hope to be able to chat again at some point, maybe do another chapter in John with you guys. But I want to say